How on earth does one successfully conclude a series like Dark Souls? How do you write the last page of this sprawling epic and say, okay, looks complete? Can it even be accomplished? Well, after playing through and beating Dark Souls 3 The Ringed City, I can tell you that it has been accomplished, I think. This video will be about my impressions of the DLC, some pros and cons, a bit on the lore side of things, and whether I believe the series has been concluded successfully and respectfully. Be warned, as this video will contain spoilers aplenty for the entire DLC. If you want to know my general thoughts before I go into spoiler territory, I'd say that The Ringed City is worth getting, and you get a lot of worth out of your $15, a lot more than you did for Ashes of Ariandel. That being said, it's not all sunshine and rainbows. Okay, straight off the bat, I will tell you that The Ringed City feels like a much more complete package compared to Ashes of Ariandel. The areas are pretty big, and just as importantly, they feel huge, as if you're not too sure where the bounds of play are, which is a great feeling. The DLC essentially adds 3 new areas: Dreg Heap, Earthen Peak, and The Ringed City. You might be able to say that the final arena could be considered its own area, but we'll talk about that later. Something that really sold The Ringed City to me within the first few hours of play is a general sense of unease that is felt as you play through it. You're not sure what's going to be around every corner, and the enemies can really pack a punch. Something I'd like to get out of the way right now is that by far one of the biggest disappointments and bizarre choices from the DLC was Lap. Lap was hyped up as this cool new character, an amnesiac hollow who had forgotten his past. His goal, as he tells you, is to find the Purging Monument so he can get his memory back. I was so excited by this concept and the potential of it. Maybe as a knight who had his memory stolen from him, or has a family, or is a furtive pygmy, or it's just patches. It's fucking patches. I knew it was the same voice actor because after playing every game in the Soulsborne series, I know who he sounds like. I thought he was just acting another character. I gave From the benefit of the doubt that Lap would actually be an interesting new character. Well, it didn't really turn out that way, at least in my opinion. I thought they could have done a lot more with it. Oh well, back to the analysis. One thing that was seen in previews of the DLC were the angels. While playing against them, it certainly feels like a challenge as you run from cover to cover, attempting to find their pilgrim pupa. I believe there's still one I couldn't find. That being said, their attacks do feel quite cheap occasionally as they fire volley after volley of angelic magic at you. I can definitely see the people talking about this as a point of controversy, but you've got to hand it to From for going out on a limb and committing, at least in part, to a cat and mouse mechanic in Dark Souls. In terms of lore, however, they are very significant, and something I might talk about it in its own video at some point. It would seem that the angels are what the pilgrims of Londor turn into after they die, and this is basically why they want to die. They wish to ascend into something greater than themselves, which in turn explains what the tree-like formations growing in hollows and the hollow butterflies are all about, that we find in Lothric and the High Wall. From what I understand, I think that these butterflies are what the Lothric citizens who pledged themselves to the angelic faith became, or wished to become. Think of it like this: you're a citizen of Lothric, your king is a deviant dragon-loving wannabe, your princes are edgy teenagers who don't want to save the world, the sexy queen is gone, and you know that the world is going to end soon. However, a maiden of the queen brings news that there's another option, that if you commit yourself to Londor and the angelic faith, you can ascend into a tree butterfly thing. Well, it's better than going hollow, I guess. Let me know what you think though. Back to Dreg Heap. The rest of Dreg Heap isn't that interesting, honestly. I will say that I recognise certain buildings and areas from Lothric on occasion that were pretty much identical. That was a little disappointing, as it felt a bit like a reskin. That being said, once you do reach the Ringed City, the landscape and feel of the environment changes dramatically, both in good and questionable ways. Before that, however, we still have the first boss and also Earthen Peak. Earthen Peak is an okay area, though I feel like it's a little bit of wasted potential. Out of all the Dark Souls 2 areas that they could have included, I feel like Earthen Peak is somewhat bland. I know you've heard me say it before, but Ferosa, Astora, Karthus, or any other mention but so far unseen lands would have been welcome in my opinion. That's why the Ringed City as a location ends up being quite a sight for sore eyes, just because the colour palettes and design work done are very distinct to the entire DLC. You eventually make it through the slog of angel darts and arrive at the entry to the first boss, which I will say has one of the coolest entrances to a boss arena in the entire series. The first boss begins as a 2v1 and eventually turns into a 1v1 with 3 phases. I guess From really couldn't resist doing that after all the praise that they got for doing it with Sister Frida. Their names are Demon from Below and Demon in Pain, who become the Demon Prince. In New Game Plus 3 as a Pyromancer, this boss was very, very difficult, but also very rewarding to beat. From a lore perspective, it's cool to fight what seems to be the last ever demon far away from its home in Izalith, probably in exile after its defeat at the hands of Lorien, though I feel like this story thread had been finished up with the old Demon King. Fighting the old Demon King had a very tangible sense of finality to it, as it gives up fighting you after a final AoE attack fails to kill you. That being said, I still think that the Demon Prince is a worthy fight. After beating the demons, you travel to the Ringed City by way of the Batwing demons that have been regular appearances since Dark Souls 1 at this point. We get a great view of the Ringed City in a very similar way to how Anor Londo was introduced in the first game, without the sense of grandeur and amazingness that Anor Londo, pumped itself up to be, but still is amazing in its own way if we're telling the truth. The design is top notch and really gives us a sense of scale, not really felt since Dark Souls 1 in my opinion. The Ringed City has a lot to offer in terms of lore and exploration. I won't talk about everything, but some interesting elements are the Adjudicators, the Pygmies, and the Ringed Knights. The Adjudicators seem to be one of the last remaining bastions of Gwyn's will, making sure that his daughter, Filianor, is not disturbed from her slumber. Filianor is a very interesting character and will also probably be the topic of her own video, but from what I've read so far in game, it's possible that Filianor might be the first ever Firekeeper, which is an interesting concept and one I'll have to investigate further. The Pygmies are shown as a race rather than just one Pygmy, which is also another interesting factor. It would seem that once the furtive Pygmy discovered the Dark Soul, Gwyn understood the threat that it represented, and gave the city to the Pygmies to placate them, in a way. The existence of the Dark Soul is a danger to the reign of the gods, after all. Whether Filianor was part of the deal or not is something I haven't put a great deal of thought into yet. The Ringed Knights are a point of interest too, almost like the original Dark Wraiths, their armor and weapons forged in the Abyss. Something else that is interesting, something that I haven't thought about in a long while, is that the descriptions seem to imply that the weapons are infused with humanity or have some kind of sentience, like they know what they're doing, like there's almost like a soul in the weapon itself. It'd be interesting to see if this pops up in other parts of the series. Something I'd like to touch on really briefly is that, at least for me, this DLC had an actual feeling of relief upon finding a bonfire at one point, which is something I didn't feel really like I'd experienced in the entirety of the time I played Dark Souls 3. I think most of us can agree that Dark Souls 3 had way too many bonfires. This moment I experienced might have just been due to me exploring a new area though that I was unfamiliar with. Again, there's going to be quite a few things I don't go into detail on, like the Herald Knights and the Locusts. I want to discuss these things in lore videos as they all play very important and interesting roles. I think that's something worth noting as well though. The Millwood Knights and the Followers were interesting, but they didn't really add up to anything apart from that they were forlorn in the end, which is a term that could be applied to pretty much any Dark Souls character. While I like the Ringed City area for the most part, it's also worth mentioning that it's not designed like a Dark Souls 3 area. Dark Souls 3 was for the most part quite linear, which I don't have much of a problem with by the way, but the Ringed City has much more of a vertical, layered feeling to it, which sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. Obviously the great plunges that your character makes are visually appealing, but when you're trying to clear the Ringed City, it can often feel like you're running in circles. Like you're not always going to be 100% sure about where you've been and where you haven't. People like to criticize Dark Souls 3 for being too linear, but I'd argue that Dark Souls 1 was almost just as linear, even to the same degree in some cases. Let's discuss Medea. Medea is a dragon that fought against the Abyss, and has an interesting background lore-wise. I'd also say that I think the design and presentation of Medea, especially in the boss arena, is exceptional. However, and this is a big however, fighting Medea is quite difficult. Now, I would say that a boss like the Orphan of Kos is challenging, sure, same goes for Ornstein and Smo. Medea is difficult to manage and difficult to fight, but not in a way that feels challenging. It almost feels unfair, which is something that makes me uncomfortable to say. I hate calling the Souls games unfair because in most cases they aren't. In most cases the fights are fair, and the Ringed City does understand this, which we will discuss later, but Medea is different. First off, he's enormous, and the camera does not really change to accommodate this. Half the deaths I suffered were often one of his giant limbs coming down on me after I had dodged the first anticipated attack. If I'm perfectly honest, I still haven't beaten him. I think the furthest I've got him down to so far is around 60 to 70% health. I'm still planning on fighting him again and defeating him, but I'm not sure if I have the energy at the moment. Let's take a moment to discuss the weapons introduced in the DLC. Something I always look for when going into a Soulsborne DLC is whether the weapons and items presented are PvE focused or PvP focused. I believe in the case of the Ringed City they are mostly PvP focused, which is a bit of a shame since I'm primarily a PvE player. I am that way only because I like experimenting and trying different builds for beating the game in ways that I hadn't considered before, and also because the netcode fucking sucks being in Australia and not having a great internet connection. But anyway, with the weapons provided in the DLC, there aren't many viable options that I've encountered so far for PvE. The Split Leaf Greatsword, which uses the same moveset as the Black Knight Glaive, is heavier than the former and does less damage. As a caveat to that, however, the weapon art on the Greatsword, and for the others to be honest, are great and look very cool. I haven't had a chance to try all of them out yet, but I'm hoping for some variety when I do. Now, let's get to the part that I really wanted to talk about. If the first 90 to 95% of the Ringed City stays around 6 out of 10 to 7 out of 10 in terms of enjoyability and quality, and that's just my personal take mind you, then I'd say that the last 10% to 5% of content in the Ringed City is a 9 out of 10, or possibly higher. Now, that might be a controversial statement, but let me continue. On reflection, the fight with Half-Light in Filianor's church is not great. If you're online, chances are you're going to be old monked in a PvP fight with someone, while offline you'll be up against Half-Light, a fairly standard sorcerer katana NPC. Not very exciting and fairly forgettable. Everything after this point, however, is fantastic, in my opinion. After beating the boss, you go upstairs and find Filianor. She is a sleeping woman, the daughter of Gwyn, and I guess the last surviving child of the gods. She rests on a broken egg. I loved walking into this room and it just being deathly quiet. No wind, no ambience, just silence. I must say that Filianor's chamber and the presentation of everything is just so top tier. It's very ominous and fitting that Gwyn's last child is somewhat of the plug that holds everything together. Another thing is that getting here felt earned, like a present waiting to be unwrapped. Let's go ahead and do exactly what every NPC has told us not to do so far. Upon interacting with the egg, it cracks and crumbles in a heap, and Filianor awakens for a moment, only to disappear in a great explosion of light. It's worth mentioning that Filianor appears to be blind and wears something resembling the Firekeeper's mask on her forehead. This harks back to my theory that I was talking about earlier that perhaps Filianor is the first Firekeeper. I'll have to look over the item descriptions discussing the Firekeepers at some point to discover the truth. The one question that was running through my head for pretty much the entire DLC is why everything in the Ringed City is trying to keep you away from Filianor. Well, we find out pretty quickly why we have been kept away. What happens after the explosion of light is of paramount importance to both Dark Souls 3 and the series as a whole. When the light fades, Filianor is dead, and appears to have been this way for some time. The chamber itself is ruined and decrepit, and we're not really sure what's just happened. But soon, after walking outside the chamber, we discover what really has occurred. Outside the tower is endless desert, save for a few remaining husks of buildings in the distance, some looking like Anor Londo and Lothric. This is completely incongruent with where we just were, and obviously begs a question as to what has just occurred. My personal theory at this current time, which may change, is that the reality or world that we experience in Dark Souls was preserved somewhat by Filianor's slumber. Once she was awoken, that reality was shattered, and we see the world as it really is. Does this sound like a possibility to you? Let me know. Are we just a figment of Filianor's imagination? Anyway, we travel outside and see a crawling figure coming towards us, warning us of the Red Hood. Red Hood should make you think of Gale, right? Could it be the undead that has aided us this far? As we follow the trail of blood, the truth becomes apparent. Gale has become corrupted by the power of the Dark Soul, has become a consumer of men, perhaps unbelieving that the Dark Soul is not a glowing radiance anymore, but only blood. Seeing the beast that Gale has become, it falls to us to fight him. This was the 5% of the Ringed City that I was talking about becoming a 9 out of 10. Gale keeps talking to us as if he needs the Dark Soul to complete the painter's painting, and I'd like to say right now that the final fight with Gale is now one of my all-time favourite boss fights in the Soulsborne series. I absolutely love it. Consider this, the final fight in the Souls series is between two undead, surrounded by the crumbled kingdoms of ages past, fighting over something that doesn't even exist anymore. What could be more poignant, more Dark Souls than that? Apart from that, the boss mechanics are classic and work brilliantly. Gale is sort of a cross between Artorias and Gurman. Fast, brutal attacks that increase in severity the longer that the fight goes on. This is one usage of the 3-phase fight that I think actually works. It probably took me around 20 attempts or so to beat Gale, and fortunately, I'm glad to say that I had the same satisfaction beating him that I had when I beat my very first boss in Souls. Some of you might disagree, some of you might say that he was easy, but for me, personally, it was perfect. Dark Souls, at the end of the day, is your story, and in a way, Gale was my boss. It was everything I wanted, and I really couldn't be happier with the last boss of the series. You take the remains of the Dark Soul to the painter, and she begins her work on a new world, and to leave the old one behind. Is the Ringed City perfect? Absolutely not. Is it awful? No way. Does it have both sloppy parts and incredible parts? In my opinion, yes. With that, I think I'll close off for now. I'm planning a slew of new videos to come out over the coming weeks, so there's a lot to look forward to. I'd like to thank my patrons for their continued support as well. It really means a lot to me. Starting next month, I should be able to select our first community chosen video, so keep your eyes peeled for that. Until next time.